Hello, and welcome to our ISBER webinar, ISBER Best Practices, Recommendations for Repositories from Collection to Discovery. I'm Mariana Bledsoe, Chair of the ISBER Science Policy Advisory Committee, and I will be moderating today's session. As leaders in the development of best practices for repositories, the International Society for Biological and Environmental Repositories announced on Wednesday the release of the fourth edition of the ISBER Best Practices. The best practices are freely available for download on the ISBER website. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide some background on the development of the ISBER best practices and an overview of some of the major changes. We will also provide an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have about the new best practices. ISBER is the only global forum that addresses harmonization of the technical, legal, and ethical issues related to repositories. ISBER fosters collaborations, creates education and training opportunities, provides a forum for the dissemination of state-of-the-art policies, processes, and research findings, and provides an international showcase for innovative technologies, products, and services. Together, these activities promote best practices that cut across the broad range of repositories that ISBER serves. Just to give you an overview of the plan for today's session, Daniel Simeon Duboc will lead off by providing some background on the ISBER best practices and the rationale and process for updating them. He will then be followed by Heidi Wagner, who will present an overview of the major changes to the best practices. Kathy Seiler will talk about the dissemination plan, the adaptation of other ISBER materials to align with the best practices, and their translation into other languages. We will then conclude with a discussion session where we can address some of the questions you may have. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Simeon Duboc. He is a consultant with MedService Biobank Consulting Services, Walk Hill, Switzerland. Daniel was intimately involved with the development of the best practices through his leadership on the ISBER Standards Advisory Committee. Daniel?
Thank you, Mariana. Hello, everybody. I also want to welcome you to this webinar. Modern biobanking, as I see it, was established about 20 years ago when the human genome first was described and published in Nature in the year 2000. At this time, the most critical issues in biobanking were ethical, legal, and social issues, quality, and ownership. The importance and acknowledgement of biobanks at that time were low. This changed in the following decade when biobanking was named one of 10 ideas that is changing the world right now in a cover story by Time magazine. In this period, sustainability and reproducibility were the hot topics in biobanking. And now, with the publication of the fourth edition of the ISBER Best Practice and with the ISO norms coming soon, modern biobanking will see a move towards more professionalism in biobanking. What are best practices? Best practices are techniques, procedures, or methods that are used to maintain quality and are complementary to standards. The ISBER best practices are such guidelines described effective practices for management of human and environmental repositories. If applicable, and whenever possible, best practices should be consents as well as evidence-based. And what are the differences between best practice and standards? Best practices do not constitute a mandatory standard. Rather, there are recommendations that can support the development of standard operating procedures in the context of repositories' quality management systems. In contrast, standards represent requirements that are often used to pursue conformity assessments such as accreditation or certification. As you know, ISBER was established in the year 1999 and will celebrate its 20th anniversary next year. One of the key objectives of ISBER was, and still is, to develop harmonized principles in the science and management of repositories. Therefore, in 2005, the first edition of the ISBER best practice was published. It addressed only human specimens and was US-centric, which made sense, since at this time most of the ISBER members were located in the US anyway. As the society grew and repositories outside the human area were included and more biobankers from outside the US joined ISBER, the second edition was published in 2008, expanded its scope accordingly. In the next, the third edition, cost management and more detailed specimen handling were included. And now, with the fourth edition, was released on the ISBER website. Later in this webinar, you will learn more about the changes from the third to the fourth edition. So what is the aim of the ISBER best practices? It should enable you to improve your policies and procedures, and by doing so improve the quality management of specimens. You can either use the best practices or ISBER best practices-based tools like the ISBER self-assessment tool to evaluate and optimize your own practices. The ISBER best practices are also very helpful when developing new procedures. From its first edition, the ISBER best practices always included comments from ISBER members as they represent the experts in the field. The key topics included are the scientific, technical, legal, and ethical issues of repositories of all types of samples. As mentioned before, the ISBER best practices are guidelines on effective practices for management of human and environmental repositories. In the best practice document, you will often find the term best practices followed by some detailed description. They include operations that are above the basic recommended practices or are specifically described the most effective practices. And last but not least, they include standardized terminology and definitions for global biobanking. The ISBER best practices are not detailed procedures, but rather will guide you how to develop your own policies and procedures. We do not expect the majority of repositories to be able to fully comply with the ISBER best practices. However, you should select these recommendations that you want to implement based on your own analysis of the environment your repository is in. And you always have to take into consideration the external regulations requirements that apply to your repository. While the fourth edition of the ISBER best practice reflects the latest update, Biobank will continue to further evolve, leading to new development, technologies, and regulations. Therefore, we are about to start the updating process for the fifth edition. Such an updating process is quite time-consuming, and as you can see, the process for the fourth edition started more than 1 year ago, in last quarter of the year 2016. Many people were involved and contributed. And of course, the editorial board always played a key role. Multiple groups were involved in the reviewing process. And after the final approval of the ISBER board of the fourth edition of the ISBER best practice, this document could be released and published, which I hope you all are aware of. And now I would like to hand over to Heidi Wagner. Heidi is the manager of the Institutional Tissue Bank at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. She is also a member of the ISBER ENT committee. Heidi will give you an overview of the changes from the third to the fourth edition. Please, Heidi.
Good morning, Danielle. Thank you for the kind introduction. Today I'm going to go over the summary of changes from the 3rd to 4th edition. The 4th edition builds on the foundations established in the previous versions. It includes new areas of interest to the biobanking community, expands and updates the existing topics, and presents an international perspective that reflects the growing diversity of the ISBER membership. Under the section of new topics, the ISBER best practices provide new recommendations in both managerial and technical aspects of repository management, such as governance, development, and operations. The document also includes guidance on regulatory compliance and ethical, legal, and social issues relevant to biorepositories. Additions to quality assurance include implementation of quality metric systems, such as key performance indicators, and documentation of nonconformities and corrective and preventative actions. To ensure the availability of fit-for-purpose research specimens, the best practices have incorporated new technologies and state-of-the-science approaches in specimen collection, handling, storage, and dissemination. These new topics include guidance on the identification of appropriate labels and identifiers based on the type of storage container and environment, as well as recommendations on cold chain management and validation. Innovations in specimen storage and processing systems are included in the 4th edition, and new topics related to repository information management systems are addressed. Under the areas of expansion in the 4th edition, as the diversity of the ISBER membership has grown, it has become necessary for the best practices to expand issues relevant to a variety of types of repositories and specimen collections. Guidance on the development of a governance plan and its inclusion of the repository business plan are presented in greater depth. Significant updates were made in areas addressing quality management, method validation, and other quality control considerations. Additional details were included in sections addressing the legal and ethical issues from collection of non-human biospecimens, and in topics related to the specimen destruction, culling, and transfer of a collection and specimen associated data. Additional areas of expansion, specimen types and processes were added to the sections on specimen collection, processing, receiving, and retrieval. This includes additional considerations for the cooling rewarming of specimens and freeze-thaw cycles that occur when the specimens are handled and introduced or removed from storage, as well as during transport or shipping. Several section titles were changed from the 3rd edition to include new and expanded topics or reflect changes in terminology. An example of title change was that publishing and provision of data to repositories retitled to Acknowledging Repositories and Reporting Utilization. In some cases, editors determined that certain topics in existing sections should be relocated and incorporated into their other sections. An example of relocation is records management incorporated now into quality management. Some changes were due to advances in technology or new methodology. An example of section updates is that informatics updates in biorepository information management systems. As mentioned previously, the term best practice is used when the recommendation is at a level of operation above the basic recommended practice, or to more specifically designate the most effective practice. An example of this is the basic recommendation for repositories using motor generators for backup power to choose a system based upon a risk management assessment of the facility. A best practice regarding the usage of generators is to ensure that a supply of fuel is available for a minimum of 48 hours, but preferably 72 hours. The appendices in the 4th edition of Best Practices includes a table of Internet resources for various organizations and sources referenced throughout the document, organized by subject, with the web link and a brief description of the information available on the site. Standardization of terminology and definitions. The document utilizes terminology that is generally understood among all repositories, limiting the use of sector-specific terms. Glossary provides clarification where terms are used ambiguously in the biobanking community. An example of this is the use of specimen and sample that vary significantly when used in a clinical versus biodiversity and or environmental setting. That concludes the summary of changes. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kathy Seiler, who is going to go over the communications and dissemination strategies. Kathy is located at St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, and she is chair of the ISBER Communications Committee.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for the really wonderful overview of the changes in the best practices. Now, for those of you who haven't downloaded the best practices already, they were published on Wednesday, and you can find them on the ISBER website at the link that you see there, isber.org/bestpractices. We're also continually putting information out onto the Internet, in particular over social media, which includes our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages, which we encourage you to join to get the most up-to-date information about both the best practices as well as other ISBER activities. You can also follow along on social media using the hashtags that you see here, ISBER Best Practices, ISBER BP 2018, or Biobanking Best Practices 2018. In addition, if you have additional ideas, suggestions, questions, or would like to be involved in the next version of the ISBER Best Practices, please feel free to send an email to bestpractices@isber.org. Additionally, a special edition will be of the Biobanking and Biopreservation Journal will be published on February 15th, which is called Special Sections on Standard, Tools, and Best Practices for Modern Biobanking. In this series of articles, information will be provided including the summary of best practices, history, process, and changes, updates on a number of the tools that use the best practices, including the self-assessment tool, the SPREC code, and ISBER best practice-based education from CITRNet. There'll be information provided about the CAP Biorepository Accreditation Program, an update on the ISO standards, and an ISBER Corner article about the intent and use of the best practices. The link at the bottom of the screen will bring you directly to biopreservation and biobanking, and you can also find a link to the BioJournal through the ISBER website. Citing the best practices is going to be done using the ISBER Best Practices summary document that is in the Bio Special Edition that's going to be published on February 15th. The reference is listed here, and it will also be listed on our website on the Best Practices webpage. In addition to the best practices themselves, there's plans in place to adapt ISBER materials that currently align with the best practices 3rd edition to align with the best practices 4th edition. This includes the CITRNet online education and the ISBER self-assessment tool. We've provided links to both of those here, but please keep in mind that these currently reflect 3rd edition of the best practices and not the 4th edition. We'll be sure to send out information when these tools have been updated with 4th edition information through the ISBER forum and also through our social media. Additionally, the Education and Training Committee plan on coordinating a number of webinars from ISBER experts on important topics covered in the ISBER Best Practices Guidelines. Additionally, translations of the ISBER Best Practices are already underway. The first set of translations will be simplified Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, and French. If you're interested in being notified immediately when these translations are available, again, visit the website, and there are specific emails that you can email ISBER, and we will let you know as soon as these translations are available. We also plan on having additional translations to follow, and again, all of this will be announced on our social media. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending the webinar and provide special thanks to all of the speakers within our session, as well as the individual contributors to the 4th edition of the Best Practices. In particular, I'd like to thank our Editor-in-Chief, Lori Campbell, and the Associate Editors, which you can see listed here, the Best Practices Task Force, the Head Office, the International Review Board, and the Standards Advisory Committee, as well as all others who have been involved in the development of these best practices. I also want to highlight that in addition to this webinar and the articles in bio, we do have plans to present in more detail about the best practices at a variety of meetings. This includes the Biospecimen Research Symposium, which will be held in Luxembourg in February, the ISBER annual meeting, which will be held in Dallas in May, and the 20th anniversary of ISBER meeting being held in Shanghai in 2019. In addition to these meetings, we do have plans to present at the African Society for Laboratory Medicine annual meeting and a NIST meeting, both later this year and both with details to follow. If you're interested in having somebody participate at a meeting that you are hosting or attending and talk about the ISBER best practices, please feel free to email us, and we'd be very excited to participate in your meeting. And with that, I will pass over to our moderator, Mariana Bledsoe, who will help moderate the questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We'll now take some questions from the audience. Please remember to type in your questions into the participant feedback box that's in the left-hand bottom of your screen, rather than raising your hand. That will be much more effective. We've got one question, that is, when will the slides from today's presentation be available? These slides and the video audio will be posted within a week to the ISBER group forum and on the ISBER website under the webinar archive. I had a question about some of the release of some of the tools. Kathy, do you know when the self-assessment tool will be updated and released?
I do not know when it's going to be released. However, I know that this is a project that's actively being worked on, and plans are underway to do this updating, and all of the information about when it will be updated will be provided to our membership, again through the ISBER forum and over social media as things become available.
Thank you. We've just received another question, and that is, how does the 4th edition align with the NCI and the NHLBI best practice documents? Kathy, is that one that you will want to take, or Daniel?
Perhaps that's something that Lori would be best able to answer.
Sure. The ISBER best practices covers both biological and environmental repositories. The NCI best practices are, of course, very human-specific and U.S.-centric. So while there are some overlaps in the recommendations, ISBER best practices are much more broad to apply to a wider audience. But there are several people, of course, in the industry that worked on the NCI best practices that also worked on ISBER best practices.
Thank you, Lori. Question we've just received as what do you anticipate being the most impactful change in the 4th edition? In other words, what should people review first?
That's really hard to say. I mean, start by reading the introduction, and then honestly just search for the topics that apply to you. We of course have the ethical legal issues for human versus non-human, and those are now separated out a bit easier. I think there's so much in there that applies to you, whether you're just developing a biobank or if you're currently managing one and just want to improve your quality. So I can't say that there's one specific section more important than the other, because I think they're all important, but I am biased.
It is certainly the publication by Lori in Bio, where you can find a table of the most significant changes, might help you to identify those topics that you are A, most interested in, and B, want, according to your own analysis, need to adapt first. So if you go to this publication, which is out in about 2 weeks' time, that can be very helpful.
Okay, another question from the audience is whether the distribution is restricted to ISBER members, or can others download it for free? May it be distributed after download to others? The ISBER best practices are freely available on the ISBER website. There's other questions that have come in related to what kinds of presentations will be at the Dallas meeting about the best practices. Kathy, do you want to take that one?
There certainly is going to be a workshop at the Dallas meeting. I don't know the details of what's going to be presented, but it will certainly be presenting more details about the best practices in that workshop.
Another question that we've received is anybody, if perhaps Lori, if you or Kathy could weigh in on this, if you could say a little bit more about the changes on cold chain validation.
I think that's best to go to Lori.
Yes. Honestly, I can't provide specifics right now without having the document in front of me. I just know that there's additional details that were added by experts in the field. So I highly recommend downloading the best practices and read the entire section.
Okay. I'm afraid that we don't. I think if there are other questions, please, if people could please send them in. We're getting close to our time. If you do have additional questions, please send them in to bestpractices@isber.org. All of the questions will be answered afterwards and be posted to the group forum for everybody to see. I think that since hearing no other questions, if there are any other comments from our presenters today, otherwise we would like to conclude today's session. We hope that over the coming weeks and months that you will review the best practices and send us any questions and comments that you may have. Your feedback is very important to help us clarify the document in future editions. I'd like to thank today's speakers for their presentations and the attendees for participating in today's session. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much.
That does conclude today's conference. Thank you for your participation.